Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Excuse the feedback. We're running a couple minutes late coming out of the previous session, so just giving ourselves a little time, let other people a few minutes to join. Thank you. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. My name is Jay Monteverde. This is a panel on legal empowerment or infusing law into community organizing for environmental justice. I'm the lead of the U.S. Environmental Justice Program at Namati, a global legal empowerment organization. And I'm joined by two of our excellent advocates in the U.S. Environmental Justice Program, Rhonda Hamilton and Jennifer Kunze. So what we thought we'd do is start by, I'll give hopefully a quick presentation on what we mean by legal empowerment, just so we can sort of lay the foundation and everyone is on the same page about what we're sort of talking about and what we mean by infusing community organizing with law. And then really get into a sort of discussion after that quick introduction with Rhonda and Jennifer about the work that they've been doing to address environmental issues using these approaches of bringing together law and community organizing. Just a logistical matter, excuse my double appearance. My connection is shaky, so I'm on two devices in case I lose a connection on one of them. I can fall back pretty quickly. So let me get started by sharing my screen and doing this quick introduction. Okay, hopefully that works. So what do we mean by legal empowerment? Legal empowerment, it started as an idea that's really sort of started taking shape around 20 years ago. And at its core, it's about bringing law closer to the people, especially the people who most need the law to help protect their rights. So people and communities who lack power and for whom the power of the law can be really important to helping them see justice in their lives and in the surroundings they live in. And whether they lack power because of a lack of money, lack of political clout, or because of the racial, ethnic, gender, religious, et cetera, groups that they belong to, law is supposed to help protect marginalized groups. And legal empowerment is about bringing law closer to that ideal. And ultimately, it's about equipping people in marginalized communities to know, use, and shape the law. So whereas traditional use of law, especially in a place like the United States that has a very sort of evolved legal system and legal sort of world, traditional law focuses a lot on lawyers. Legal empowerment says you don't always need a lawyer to know, use, and shape the law. Instead, legal empowerment focuses on what we call legal empowerment advocates, or what in other countries are called barefoot lawyers or community paralegals. And they are grassroots advocates who are at the front lines, ideally from the communities they are representing or working with, and they're skilled in organizing, they're skilled in working with people, and they're community minded. And they are facilitators of law, connecting law to the community members and working together to uncover legal problems and identify action strategies. And in contrast to a traditional lawyer who might say, I will solve this problem for you, the legal empowerment advocate or the barefoot lawyer would say, you and I, we will solve this problem together and we will grow more powerful. And so Namati has focused on the legal empowerment approach in about half a dozen countries to address many different types of issues, from community land rights, citizenship rights, women's rights, etc. And we also convene a global network of over 2,000 organizations that all focus on legal empowerment in for different issues. And they cover almost every country across the globe. So this picture is of a community meeting in India, which is our longest standing environmental justice program. And this is one of our barefoot lawyers, literally barefoot, holding a community meeting to address an environmental justice issue. The eyes have been blocked to protect identity. And then this is one of the communities that community paralegals are working with in India. These are 4 women who are residents in a community that is adjacent to a bauxite mine. And bauxite is the mineral that is processed to create aluminum. And this bauxite mine, or this bauxite facility, had an uncovered large pile of bauxite just in the open air. And every time the wind picked up, that bauxite would just spray dust across their homes, their food, and their clothes. And just, you know, they joked darkly that they were eating bauxite masala in their food. And this is a before and after of the work that the residents engaged in with the barefoot lawyer who was working with them. On the left is that pile of bauxite. It's completely in the open. And again, anytime the wind picked up, it would just cover the whole village in a cloud of dust. And then on the right is what happened after, is what it looked like after the residents and the community paralegal pushed the environmental agency to make the facility adhere to dust control regulations, or shut down until they could do so. So the facility shut down, and life has been infinitely better for the residents who live right next to it. In some places, legal empowerment can mean the difference between safely addressing a toxic problem and risking arrests and prison sentences for disturbing the peace in places that have, you know, authoritarian governments or very sort of restrictive types of civil society spaces. And in some of my previous work, I worked in China with environmental NGOs that were pushing to address pollution. And one especially stark example that I sometimes think back to is we were working with environmental justice organizations in one village, and unfortunately we're not able to work with organizations in the next village. And these villages were very close to each other. They both had new factories being constructed and wanting to start operations. And those factories would have polluted the soil, the groundwater, and the air in those villages. In the village where we were working with them to understand information transparency rules, so the China's equivalent of the Freedom of Information Act, and to understand the regulatory processes so that their objections were channeled into these acceptable avenues of you know, expressing public concern. In the other village where we unfortunately were not able to work, they didn't have that knowledge and they resorted to public protest. And in a place like China that very much values public stability, open protest is a very, very big no-no. And so in that situation, in that village, villages were arrested. The local officials were sacked because they were held responsible for the public unrest. And the facility was allowed to go on with its construction and start polluting. In the village where there was illegal empowerment and they used careful channels to avoid political sensitivity, they used the legal channels to avoid political sensitivity, they actually were able to stop the factory's development until it could comply with producing an environmental impact assessment and showing that it could comply with all of the relevant pollution regulations. So again, in some places, the difference in approaches can mean a lot, can mean the difference between success and much, much worse results. Of course, this is very different from, you know, in the US, but there are also some key similarities in the US. These are pictures of neighborhoods in DC and Maryland. On the left is a proposed highway in Frederick, Maryland. That's the blue sort of fuchsia line. And the magenta lines or the magenta outlines are known toxic waste sites from a bioweapons development facility in that area. And so as you can see, the blue line, the proposed highway, crisscrosses through them, and that can create very serious toxic waste and environmental health problems. Those sites are actually on the Superfund National Priorities list. On the top is a Google Maps screenshot from the Buzzard Point neighborhood that Rhonda represents, or sort of, advocates for and is from. And it's one of the concrete facilities in that area, and the kind of dust that is spread across the neighborhood. And that is a public street. You can probably see that's our street, Southwest. So that's outside that company's property, and it just looks like a terrible construction site. And that kind of pollution has resulted in elevated asthma rates and a lot of environmental health problems in Buzzard Point. And the last picture on the bottom right is southern Baltimore's Curtis Bay neighborhood, and a large pile of coal that just is towering over the neighborhood and blows coal dust across the neighborhood. If you look at the windowsills or any sort of surface in that neighborhood, you'll see a layer of black soot. You look at the gutters and they're lined with, it almost looks like a painted black line in the gutters, and that's all coal dust. One of the companies that works in this area sweeps the streets, and they were under threat of not complying with pollution regulations themselves, because there was so much coal dust in the water that they were using to sweep up the streets, that they were being at threat of being regulated. So in the US, in places like these, as I'm sure a lot of people are familiar, there is gross environmental injustice. At the same time, there are so many lawyers in the US. So there's two things happening at the same time. There's a lot of lawyers, but the access to lawyers is not equitable, lawyers are not uniformly available for different demographics and different communities. And at the same time, in the US, there are very strong and rich community organizing traditions in the environmental justice as well as other justice movements. So you have this strong community organizing background, and you have a very sort of strong legal world or legal realm. But the legal realm, a lot of times when people think about law, they're focused specifically on litigation, which is really only one type of use of the law. And many communities, many people at the front lines or at the fence line feel like in order to access the power of the law, they need to find a lawyer. And so we at Namati were talking with a wide range of activists and lawyers across several regions of the country that are acute environmental justice regions. And we also met and had many discussions with longtime environmental justice leaders, including Dr. Jacoby Wilson, Adriana Hollis, Vernice Miller-Travis, and Fred Tutman, all of whom sit on Namati's U.S. Environmental Justice Advisory Board. And these conversations showed us that the environmental justice movement in the US can benefit from work to bring law closer to environmental justice communities. So as we've started our environmental justice work in the US, we're continuously learning from these leaders and activists, and we're working with a cohort of legal empowerment advocates, including Jennifer and Rhonda, who are in the DC and Maryland area, and we're working with them to adapt legal empowerment to the fight for environmental justice here. So today's discussion with Jennifer and Rhonda is really, would like to talk through what it looks like to start from observing lived impacts or observing, potential pollution or environmental justice problem, to applying legal empowerment approaches, to researching regulatory frameworks and understanding what legal conditions are applicable to the facilities, and then working towards a remedy. And really sort of through talking through cases and issues, talking at a sort of very practical level about what it means to fuse environment or law and community organizing. And so once you go beyond individual cases, the vision of a legal empowerment is actually also larger. And through building casework where you know law and use law, you develop a very clear picture of what environmental law and what these different regulations look like at the ground level, how they're actually being implemented. And when you have that information, you can push for systemic change in how laws are implemented or reforms to existing laws and regulations based on very concrete evidence. And that's the shape law part of it. And that's the sort of larger vision of legal empowerment, where you actually can change the law to become more just at the systemic level. And then you apply those reforms back to the casework. So at its core, the idea of legal empowerment is that people should have a say in the rules and institutions that shape their daily lives. And it's it's a vision of a deeper democracy. And so with that, let me turn off the screen sharing, if I can manage to do that. That's about it. Oops. Stop share. Okay. And I see Jennifer is... hi, Rhonda. So with that, let me turn to Rhonda and Jennifer. And again, they've both been working with Namati's environmental justice program here in the US. And you're also both community organizers and activists. So can we start, maybe ask each one of you, Rhonda, perhaps if you could go first to introduce yourself and talk about some of the work and the environmental justice issues you've been working on. I think you're muted, sorry.
My apologies. And thank you, Jay. Yes, I live in Southwest Washington, D.C., which is right near the Buzzard Point community in Southwest. And that area is an industrial brownfield site that contains a lot of pollutants. And we deal with a lot of fugitive dust from the particular area. So my work has been around working with community members and supporters to raise awareness for the hazards that we're dealing with from that industrial area. Most of the residents who live in close proximity are low-income residents and moderate-income homeowners. And a lot of us our health has been adversely impacted by that area, which is now the home of the DC United Soccer Stadium. So in the midst of so much in construction and so many projects to bring that area online, the community has been detrimentally impacted by the release of all those toxic chemicals into the air, in addition to some plants that are operating down there, which we will talk more about. And so that has been what I've been working with Namati with legal empowerment to address the concerns through working on specific projects within that site.
Thanks very much, Rhonda. Jennifer, the same question. Can you introduce yourself and your work, please?
Yeah, hey everybody, thanks for being here. I'm a community organizer with Clean Water Action, which is a large environmental group that was originally founded to get the Clean Water Act passed, and have been really lucky there and in partnership with Namati to be working on a number of local issues in Baltimore City, where I live now, and in Frederick County, where I grew up. And one of those, Jay highlighted in his presentation, the hazardous waste disposal sites on the campus of Fort Detrick, a military installation in Frederick City that I grew up right outside of, where a lot of bioweapon and biodefense research was done in the 60s and is still being done today. And much of the materials from that were not exactly carefully and properly disposed of in the 60s. And so much of it was disposed of in just open unlined landfill pits on what's called Area B. And as Jay mentioned, those are now on the Superfund National Priorities list, the contaminants from there have entered the groundwater and move in really unpredictable ways in the karst geology in that area and have impacted people's drinking water wells and surface water as well. So we've been working to address that contamination and make sure that it's adequately considered in city planning, which we'll talk more about in a minute. And then here in Baltimore City, where I live now, I've been working for a number of years alongside a lot of community partners on the issue of sewage backing up into people's homes, which happens all across the city thousands of times a year. Last year, almost 5,000 incidents were reported to 311, the city's non-emergency number. And the city, they're caused by a number of reasons. It's happened to me in small quantities, but just from tree roots getting into the sewer lateral pipe. But the largest sewage floods, the ones that are really, really hazardous to people's health and to people's financial well-being, are caused by rainfall, when large amounts of rain are able to get into the sewer pipes because our sewage system is very old and very leaky, and then overwhelms the system and causes the sewage to have to go somewhere, and often the most convenient spot is people's basements. So we've been working for a number of years now alongside a lot of partners to improve the way that the city handles these incidents when they happen, actually for the city to provide meaningful assistance to people, and then also to look into what are the root causes of this besides tree roots, and what can the city be doing to ramp down the number of sewer backups that we're seeing more broadly.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Rhonda, can I turn back to you, and maybe let's focus in on the bridge construction project first. And can you talk about sort of the arc of how you became aware of that as an issue, and sort of the start of how you started doing advocacy and action around it?
Yes. Well, we found out in my community, the District Department of Transportation is in the process of constructing the largest project in the history of the District of Columbia, which is the new South Capitol Street Bridge. Prior to the start of construction of that project, which at this point has been going on, I want to say for about 2 years at this point, we were informed that the 100-plus-year-old bridge would be taken down completely down to Suitland Parkway in a phased redevelopment. And so us being notified by the city agency that's taking the lead on this project, we had a lot of concerns for the impacts of construction. For one thing, the bridge is very, very old. It contains a lot of chemicals that were acceptable back in the time where it's been constructed. So the concern was for the bridge coming down and how that would impact us in terms of air quality. In addition, the bridge is being constructed along Buzzard Point. And so the construction of the bridge has unearthed a lot of contaminants within that area in order for them to do construction of that project. As a result, a lot of community members expressed concerns for those overall impacts of the construction and health, and us being exposed to chemicals as a result of the construction process. And a lot of the community started to organize around those concerns. The bridge formed an advisory committee, which gave us a chance to sit down actually with the team to talk with them about the community concerns, because I think one of the challenges was that from the team's perspective, they have a deadline to deliver this phase redevelopment. But then at the same time, it was trying to get them to make sure that they were addressing the concerns that we have for the environmental impacts of the project. So a lot about advocacy, and one of these projects that I'm working on is just about ensuring that the concerns for the health and well-being and safety of the community are taken in consideration as the bridge project is being constructed.
And so you mentioned, Rhonda, that they notified the community about the bridge construction. I think I remember you saying that they said they had these plans for how it would be protected. Um, can you talk about how you worked with them to show them compare their plans with the reality of what was actually happening and what you had to sort of really push them on?
Yes. And what happens a lot of times when these projects are presented, they have traffic and construction management plans, they have dust control mitigation plans, they have these plans that are very well written for how the steps that they would take to mitigate the impacts of dust and other things. However, as community members, when you're on the ground, a lot of times there are gaps in these plans that result in the release of a lot of dust. We deal with a lot of black carbon emissions because you have hundreds of trucks, not only from the bridge project, but other construction sites that are going in and out. And so what we were stressing to the team is one thing to have a plan written down, but it's another thing to be in a community on the ground. We're equally as impacted as the construction workers because all of the residents live in garden style apartments and homes for the most parts. And so when we met with the team, we got a chance to express to them that we need you all to take additional mitigation steps because we're still seeing a lot of dust and the debris. We had sites with piles of different dust and contaminants that were uncovered. On days when the wind blew, they would blow the contaminants everywhere. We were concerned about protections for the children because one site, which was a clean field site, was completely uncovered and it had just huge mounds of soil. And so we had the opportunity to discuss these things with the bridge team, but also to bring them out to tour with community members, to sit down with us, to hear firsthand what our concerns were and how we were being impacted, and to also walk the site with them. And we had an opportunity to see just dust caked into the ground. You could see trucks swinging out, shortcutting through the community. You could see a huge site that was piled up. And I said, well, what is being done to protect the community? And there's clearly a disconnect between the plans that you all are implementing and how we are being impacted and how we feel on an everyday basis dealing with this project.
And what was the result of some of that advocacy and some of that organizing?
Well, the results is, for one, with the site, the Cleanfield site that was uncovered, they, as a result of the tour, they actually fenced that site in, which had made it safer because we have children that live so in close proximity to the site. The team has a community group that's sort of like the liaison between the community and the project. We began to have more discussions with them, more separate discussions one-on-one to talk about the concern. The team, in response to the concerns about air quality, we had a chance to meet with the Department of Energy and Environment air quality team to sit down and talk with the concerns about air quality. And those discussions are ongoing because I feel that us having a chance to have these discussions with them to really push to make sure that we're heard. I think that's sometimes the challenge when we're dealing with projects that have definite timetables. It's just making sure that the community is heard. And I think it took several meetings before they say, you know, we're listening, you know, what can we do to help? And I think that has shown just the community that it does take organizing and it does take sometimes multiple meetings with these entities in order to see some results with it. But I think overall, you know, it's been extremely helpful just learning, you know, how that the problems are not going to get solved overnight, but by consistently meeting with these groups and reaching out to them and having follow-up discussions with them, it does help to put us in a better position to get some of the things that we need to get addressed.
Thanks very much, Rhonda. And just for those who joined late, we're talking with Rhonda and Jennifer, who are two environmental justice advocates in DC and Maryland, respectively, about how they're using law and basic legal knowledge to infuse into community organizing and to make community organizing more strategic and more effective. So Jennifer, let's turn to you. Could you talk a little bit about the proposed highway construction project in Frederick? And can you talk a little bit more about your work there?
Yes, absolutely. And the highway construction project is sort of the most present and current iteration of decades worth of work in Frederick to have the groundwater contamination from these landfill sites at Fort Detrick addressed. When I was in middle school and high school, community leaders were fighting very hard to have those sites declared Superfund sites and put on the national priorities list, and that did ultimately come to pass. And as a result of that, the remediation is still active, going on now. And so we've been working with those community leaders on monitoring that and making sure it's well understood and transparent. But in the meantime, one of the things that we're most concerned about is a proposed beltway around the northern half, the northern 2/3 of Frederick City, that has been planned, has been mentioned in county and city plans for decades at this point. And the idea is to both alleviate current traffic problems and to allow more redundancy in the roadway network that can make more housing development possible. And the vast majority of this road network beltway around the northern half of the city is completed now. The only hole in the donut is this area that would pass through the military installation immediately adjacent to a number of the capped landfill sites with hazardous materials in them. And this has been something that folks have been concerned about for years. And the city is finally at the stage of having drafted an environmental assessment that hasn't been put out to public comment yet. And something that we've really struggled with is finding the right legal hook to work to try to, if not disrupt this plan, at least make sure that all of the potential environmental hazards are being adequately considered and compensated for. And something that I think we see in Rhonda's work as well is that so often these plans, by the time they get put out to public input and public comment, things have already been decided a long time ago. And that makes it really, really difficult unless people have just oodles and oodles of free time to sit in on very boring municipal planning sessions. It's very difficult to have meaningful public input into these projects. And so right now, what we're doing is working with a number of members of the advisory board for the Superfund site who are local residents in engaging in the City of Frederick's 2020 comprehensive planning process, which it's not specifically about the road, it's the city's entire comprehensive plan that's supposed to be in effect for the next 10 years. But the plan in its current draft calls for completing this road network on its current trajectory through the Superfund site as one of the top transportation priorities for the city. And so even though this isn't directly like we need to stop the shovels getting in the ground tomorrow, we know that if that remains as it's currently drafted in the comprehensive plan, it will make it much, much, much more difficult once we're at the stage of reviewing the environmental assessment, trying to address these problems in permit applications. If the city's top planning document still says we need this road, it will be very difficult to disrupt things at that point. And so we're working with some success in getting the language around this transportation priority changed in that comprehensive plan to make our work 2 or 3 years from now a little bit more accessible.
And just to put a finer point on the plans don't really match the reality. You and I recently took a trip to see the proposed route. And can you talk a little bit about what that actually looks like what some of what are supposed to be high speed and heavy traffic roads look like currently, and also the neighborhood, the development of pretty brand new houses that look like they were very recently constructed, and where the demographics of those developments and what they may or may not know?
Yeah, so this roadway network has kind of been incorporated into housing developments in Frederick as they've been built. And I always say that housing development is Frederick's main industry because of our both Fort Detrick as itself a enormous employment driver, and also our proximity to the 270 corridor in DC and the number of people who commute down there. So housing development and sprawl has been a big environmental problem for water quality and lots of other reasons in Frederick for a number of decades. And the housing development surrounding the military fort has also grown considerably, even just in the past decade. And so just south of this landfill site, a number of apartment buildings and townhouses and developments have been built, even just quite recently. And something that community leaders over the past decade really wanted the Planning Commission to address was, we know that the groundwater contamination from these capped landfills isn't only under the capped landfills, it's also spread in unpredictable ways because of the limestone geology of the area all across the area. And is that being considered as the city is looking at housing development on top of the contaminated plume of groundwater? Are there precautions that could be taken to make sure that you don't have vapor intrusion into those homes and apartment buildings? And in the previous comprehensive plan that was drafted in 2010, it did not include language around protecting those homes from vapor intrusion. And that was actually before we got the Superfund designation, so that's not surprising. But the current plan still doesn't either, and so it would allow for or promote continued residential development in the area without giving the Planning Commission the purview to think about those kinds of really complex problems. And as those new areas in Frederick City are being developed, the area just to the south of the contaminated landfill site is known as the Golden Mile. It's kind of a suburban commercial strip in Frederick City, and it is statistically compared with the rest of the city, lower income and more majority Black and Latino. And there's a lot of concern that this information about this contamination, especially for newer residents of Frederick City, the information just might not be getting out there because the big political battles over this were in the mid-2000s up until around 2012 to get listed as a Superfund site. And so do people know who are buying these brand new houses and apartments in this area that this is a concern? And then two, the whole roadway network has been planned through a number of neighborhoods, including the one I grew up in Frederick City. And over time, the streets that are eventually meant to be a main arterial road, 2 lanes in each direction, 50 miles per hour, have up until now been pretty small, 1 lane in each direction roads through neighborhoods that children cross on their way to the swimming pool, people ride their bikes on, and there's a lot of concern about traffic safety in turning these neighborhood lanes into main arterial roads over the next couple of years. Will that be safe for the people living in those neighborhoods?
Yeah, it was really stark what I had read the plans before and then what the reality sort of looked like. There was a very strong disconnect between those. Rhonda, turning back to you, so in addition to the bridge construction project, You mentioned there are a few facilities affecting Buzzard Point, especially concrete facilities. They're creating a lot of dust and affecting the health and raising the asthma rates in the neighborhood. Can you talk about your work in relation to those, especially the one that we're sort of in the middle of doing action around currently?
Yes, in Buzzard Point, there are 2 cement plants that are fully operational. There is one plant in particular whose permit is up for renewal. And the application for renewal of that permit was sent in February. This process of just this particular plant has been one of the biggest polluters in terms of air quality within Buzzard Point. And having an opportunity to look into this permit, and that's why I just feel that legal empowerment is just critically important, and it has helped the community in such a way in teaching and helping us to look. We decided to organize with a group of community residents and supporters through Namati, using a legal empowerment. And we learned how to research the permit, how to look into the permit, how to look into previous violations that the plant has had. This particular plant was cited by the EPA for violations. And so through the research, we were able to look at these past violations, to actually work with community members to document some of those violations through photos, taking pictures, to gathering evidence of these violations of the plants. And then we went and had phone calls, because one of the process that the permit allows, there's a public comment period that is released normally 30 days to allow community members to make comments into the permit. And what we did was, prior to that comment period being released, we organized and had group meetings to talk about the concerns, the lived impacts of the community, because a lot of the residents that live on the fence line within the plant, they deal with dust every day, truck traffic every day. And the fact that this permit for this particular cement plant is up for renewal, it gives us an opportunity to voice those concerns, to write down what we like to see in the new permit so that it is addressed. Because the permit for this facility was done several years ago. It's a very outdated permit. It does not cover the concerns that the community has. It does not require the plants to do a lot of mitigation steps. And because the plant is so old, it allows for so much dust to be released, because there are not mechanisms in place to protect the community. So the community, we've got together and we actually did our own comments prior to the comment period. We were able to research and look at the current permit. We were able to look at some of the enforcement actions that have been taking place in order to give us a better idea of some of the things that we can request the Department of Energy and Environment to require the plant to do as a regulatory to protect the community.
So you compared, one of the things it sounds like you did was you compared what other facilities might be required to do, or what kinds of dust control measures are required in other situations. And you could use that to say, hey, we want this facility to be also held to those standards. And why is this facility being held to lower standards?
Yes, and we looked at the permit actually for the other facility cement plant as well, because they went through a similar process. And we did comments into that permit that had resulted into a much stricter air permit and more requirements that are specific to taking mitigation acts. So we were able to compare that new permit that the facility received to other permits, and to make sure that we are requesting specific steps, because the current permit that the plant has, it just kind of allows it to pretty much do, or decide what to do and not to do. It is nothing specific that they have to do in terms of mitigation steps. There's nothing specific that they have to do to make sure that there is not runoff. There's a lot of things that they don't have to do. And so it kind of leaves the community with dealing with so much exposures from this dust. But the requirements that we hope to be in a new permit, we were able to compare, like you said, to other stronger permits and to write those steps down. Because our hopes is that that facility will be not allowed to continue to operate because it's done so much damage to the community. However, if it is given a new permit, we put in comments to request that it be much stricter than it is.
And you mentioned that the letter that you and the community, other community residents worked on together, you've submitted it, you've sent it in advance of the draft permit, right?
Yes, and we've sent it in advance to give the Department of Energy and Environment an opportunity to review those comments ahead of the comment period, because I think that the 30-day comment period, a lot of times it feels just so late in the process. You only have a few weeks to look at the permit, and then you hope that your comments will be taken into consideration. We decided to send out comments in advance of that period in hoping that they will have a lot of time to review those comments and to actually put them in the requirements for the new permit. And I think it gave them an opportunity to really hear from the community. And that's what I like about us sending comments, because they were comments from people that live in the community that have these everyday experiences. They were allowed to write the things that they wanted to see, that we would like to see into the permit. And I feel like it gives us a voice. You know, we're not just waiting on them to tell us what they're going to do or what they want the facility to do. We're telling them firsthand what we would like to see as those who have to live in close proximity to this plant.
I think that's a really, really good point I want to highlight just a quick second. And it's also come up in the highway construction cases strategy of going into the comprehensive plans process. Both of you are talking about saying what, like the community having a chance to say what they want instead of just reacting to something and being like on the defensive. Like they can make affirmative statements. This is what we want to see. This is how we want it. You start to sort of get towards, this is how we want our community to look like. This is what we want the environmental activities to look like in the places where we live. Have you started to see like improvements in air quality, Rhonda, like around whether it's the bridge construction fence or the permit that was previously renewed and then was made stricter because of the community actions?
Well, at this point, we're still dealing with the construction because it's ongoing. We're seeing, I think, improvements in the air quality just because we live by a bridge, and before COVID, there were about 10,000 cars that went over that bridge every day. Mm-hmm. We had a stadium, we were by both stadiums, DC United that seats 30,000, and DC Net Stadium that sits about 30,000, DC United that sits about 20,000 people. So in addition to the cement plants and the bridge project, we were just dealing with a lot of vehicular emissions. And so I think with the COVID, because we don't have as much traffic, that has improved sort of our overall air quality. But at the same time, we still have these plants in the constructions that are releasing the particulate matter just from the contaminants. So I think we've seen some improvements in our air quality, but we're still dealing with the challenges of others just because there's so much traffic. But the good thing that has come out of some of these efforts, I think, has been the mitigation. We reached out to the bridge project to try to get them to reduce the amount of trucks that are shortcutting through the neighborhood, to try to take additional mitigation steps so that we do not see the constant dust that we were seeing prior to COVID. So I think in that respects, that the fact that they're listening more, that they need to be more mindful because we're a very vulnerable community. Our exposures to particulate matter increases our vulnerability to COVID-19 as a fence line community. So I do appreciate the fact that they are taking some additional mitigation steps, but we're still dealing with a lot of particulate matter from these plants in the construction activity.
Okay. I want to invite people to please feel free to pop questions into the chat. I see one already, but yeah, welcome everybody to pop questions there. We'll have time for open Q&A in a little bit as well. Rhonda, I wanted to continue with you for another question. How have you sort of changed your approach to addressing these problems since like focusing on the type of legal empowerment aspect of it?
Well, I've changed my approach because when we first started working on these environmental challenges, our community just does not have a lot of resources. What we did is we knew we was dealing with these environmental challenges, and the concerns for the health and the impacts were being hugely overlooked. And so the thing that we thought about doing was that we could share the story of what we're going through and reach out to others to see if they would help us, and they have. You know, we've been telling the Buzzard Point story of an environmental justice community suffering from these environmental issues and concerns. And that has allowed for the community to organize around it, and also us to get a lot of supporters who cared about the community, who wanted to help, like Namati, and who basically wrapped their arms around us and say, hey, you know, we can help you to test your air quality to our university partners. We can help you to write letters. We can help you to, when you meet with these groups, because when you meet with the regulators, it's very intimidating for community members, because you're coming in as a community and you have all these people in suits that are sitting around that are experts that are telling you that you don't need to worry about this and that because they have everything under control. And why are you here? Because we already have plans that mitigate the dust. We already have construction management plans. So what are you concerned about? We're taking care of all your needs. And you're sitting there thinking, we're sick. We can barely breathe. How are these plans translating into really helping us? It's not. I remember, you know, when we met with one of the workers at the cement operation, he was coughing the whole meeting. He could barely breathe. And my heart, we're going to voice our concerns for community. And then we're like, they're just as sick as we are working on these plans. And so I think that was very difficult in just trying to speak up and speak out at these meetings, and then being told that your concerns are not warranted, because we've taken care of them. Through legal empowerment, it has taught us that you can actually challenge them with the permits. You can look through the permits and tell them where they're falling short. You can document the concerns that you have, show them pictures. I won't ever forget the first meeting where they were saying, well, this is fine. They pulled out all these pictures where things were washed down completely. There wasn't a scent of dust. And then I pulled out some photos that we took where you could see all of the dust. And they were like, when did you take this picture? I said, well, this picture was just taken. And so that's some of the things that I've learned through legal empowerment, is look at their requirements, look at their dust plans, look at their steps, and research it, look through it in details. And so when they tell you, when you're in meetings with these different agencies and they're telling you that you don't need to be concerned, you can pull out their actual permit and look at the steps and explain to them where the gaps are, what things are not being done, like a truck route, for instance. They may say, well, we have a truck route. And we say, well, your trucks are not following it because we have these photos to show that these trucks are on this street that it's not supposed to be on. And so I think that has been just extremely helpful in teaching me how to work with my community members and how to guide them in looking at these permits, and to organize around, like I said before, doing the comment periods. And it empowers them to know that they have tools now that they can use to speak up and to help us address these concerns.
Thank you. Turning back to you, Jennifer, same question. How How have you changed your approach recently? And maybe if you could talk a second about if I'm remembering right, Frederick actually tried full-blown litigation, like complex litigation, to address the toxic waste health threats. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so if I remember the sequence of things right, shortly after the Superfund designation did become official, a lot of individuals in Frederick and who had lived in Frederick banded together to try for a class action lawsuit against the military for the rates of cancer and rare cancers that occur in Frederick. And it's hotly debated statistically whether there's a cancer cluster. There was a study done a number of years ago that said that there was not. But it all depends on how you slice and dice the numbers and whether you're looking at people who currently live in Frederick versus lived in Frederick when the contamination was at its highest in the 70s and 80s, and then maybe since moved away and developed these cancers. And a lot of people put a lot of eggs in that basket of pursuing this litigation for financial damages for cancers that had occurred to them or in their families. And it went all the way up almost to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court declined to hear the case a couple of years ago. And so the community lost, but purely on a legal technicality of saying that the lawsuit wasn't valid because the military wasn't to be held to the same standards as if this contamination had been done by a private company. And so that really, I think, took the wind out of the sails of a lot of people who had been really invested in this and looking to that litigation as a solution. So now working with folks and looking forward at how can we at least make sure that we can mitigate and reduce the damage that's done by this contamination that's already in the ground and is going to remain in the ground forever, is really the direction that we're looking at working the regulatory and comprehensive planning systems now. And then also back to sewage backups, we have really pursued a dual-pronged approach with that problem of raising it as a political concern in the city council. And that was much more my experience before of getting a bunch of people down to be upset in City Hall. And we've certainly done plenty of that on this issue over the past 2 years, but also working within the consent decree system that is set up because Baltimore City is under a consent decree with the EPA to stop sewage discharges into the Inner Harbor. And then recently, due to a lot of community organizing back in 2016 and 2017, the consent decree also addresses ending sewer backups into people's homes. And so at the same time that we were organizing in City Hall, we were also bringing people, community association leaders in neighborhoods that had faced this issue to a really absurd degree, into meetings with the Maryland Department of the Environment to get them to see that the programs that the city had set up to address this problem really weren't even meeting the demands of the consent decree, let alone actually helping people to the fullest extent that the city should. And we recently had some successes where the city promised to make a number of the changes that we've been agitating for. And we didn't know what combination of political pressure from city council versus regulatory pressure from MDE led to that. But, and Jay doesn't know this, we just got access to a letter that I saw for the first time yesterday afternoon from the Maryland Department of the Environment to Baltimore City in February of this year, maybe 2 or 3 months after we would have had a couple of meetings with them outlining all of the questions that we had asked the Maryland Department of the Environment, and then MDE posing those questions to Baltimore City and saying, what are you going to do about this? And so I really think that it was a combination of both sort of the in the news, lots of angry people at City Hall, as well as being able to sort of work within the existing regulatory system, even if it doesn't demand everything of the city that we wish it would, that has got the partial solution that we're at right now accomplished.
That's really powerful. That's really cool to hear that. And yeah, it's really interesting to note the sort of, multiple strategies that you're pursuing and doing them at the same time. And yeah, the effect that can have, the impact that can have. As you've been engaged with, for example, MDE for either sewage backups or around Frederick or other issues, what has been your experience with engaging regulators or companies for that matter, when you're doing it in a more sort of specific way, in a way that is, pointing out specific regulatory issues or pointing out specific legal issues? What's been your experience with how they're reacting, and also the comprehensive planning process, like engaging in that in a sort of more in-depth way?
I think with sewer backups and MDE, I think that bringing people into the consent decree process has been really, really powerful, because a lot of times those processes can be difficult to engage in, can be opaque, and even don't necessarily have public input built into them. For example, the city launched a reimbursement program for sewer backups in April 2018 that was required by the consent decree. And the consent decree required that MDE evaluate it at the 1-year mark in April 2019, but didn't say anything about what that evaluation ought to include. And so once we were hearing from people that this reimbursement program isn't working, the design of it isn't adequate to address the financial damages that this does to us. And also we were applying for incidents that should be covered by it and getting denied reimbursement. We went to the Maryland Department of the Environment with a number of the community association leaders we've been working with and said, this is a big problem in the community. We know the consent decree doesn't require you to incorporate a public comment process into this 1-year review, but can you do it anyway? And they said yes. So we had those meetings. We had a public hearing at MDE a few months before the big hearing that happened in the city council. And I think in this instance, at least, they were really open to sort of having robust community input once that was put to them, once they were asked. And so that's been really good to see.
And so you push them to go beyond what their sort of minimum legal responsibilities are, and you basically use it as a negotiation tool, combining with grassroots mobilizing to get them to step up more than they even had to legally.
Exactly, yeah.
That's great. Rhonda, I'd like to turn back to you and sort of same question, as you've been engaging DOEE and DDOT around the bridge. And also recently you went straight to the company about truck traffic. Can you talk a little bit about what the reactions of the regulators and the company has been around this sort of, more aggressive engagement by the community, and specifically, when you're talking about, okay, we want to see this in the permit, we want to talk about this that doesn't match up with what the company is supposed to be required to do, and how their reactions have been?
Well, I think each reaction has been different, because we have a chance to meet prior to COVID with the Air Quality Associate Director. And I think the way that the regulators with Department of Energy and Environment look at it is through a different lens than what the community looks at. Because when they come out, for instance, for inspections, and then make sure that the companies are doing the things that they need to do, it's a very different experience when you're living by the facility and you're dealing with dust and other impacts from that facility. Because from a regulator perspective, in which I learned, they have certain checklists that they do, and they may find things when they come out and encourage the companies to take corrective action. Oftentimes, we do not know what happens unless we FOIA when those inspectors come out. We don't know the end results of that. We don't know, and we often don't see the correction, because when an inspector comes out, even before or after, you're still dealing with a lot of dust. And we know even when it comes to air quality monitoring, because of the ambient air standards that are set by EPA, oftentimes that gives the industries a lot of leeway. They don't violate the air quality standards because they're so high. But when you're dealing with particulate matter every day, you're experiencing a lot of negative effects like asthma, COPD, different health challenges. We have a number of people that are cancer survivors, heart disease. Your experience is very different. And I think that a lot of times there's a disconnect between those experiences from the community and what the regulators see as their role and what they can do within what they're allowed to do. And so it's been very challenging just trying to get them to understand that our everyday experiences cannot just be kind of disregarded, or just because you send an inspector out and you tell the plants to correct this and that, that doesn't mean that it's really helping the community. Because I saw the photo that you showed, Jay, with a lot of dust caked into the street. You can barely see that it's a road, a lack of black paving, just a lack of things to protect the community. And even dealing with the Department of Transportation, they have an advisory committee, which I think is great because it gives community leaders and members like me a chance to meet periodically with them. And I think that that's allow us to sort of like have a voice, but then at the same time, they have a team that's organized to complete a project. And it's very challenging oftentimes when you're saying you're not seeing this and you're not seeing that. But I do think because we've been meeting regularly, that they are more responsive and they're trying to address, and they admit that some of the concerns, especially from a health perspective, are not within sort of like their realm to control. So they know that they have to reach and connect with other agencies in order to address our concern. But I think the challenge is that a lot of times when we find communities like ours that are fence line communities, they're hard hit from so many different angles. You have general constructions, you have industry, you have traffic, you have historic pollutants, you have new pollutants that are coming into play. So it's very, very challenging in dealing with the regulators. But at the same time, I feel like meeting with them, I think, has been good and a good experience in terms of allowing the community to be able to sit down and talk to them and voice their concerns. And when you keep voicing those same concerns, it gets to a point where they're like, hey, we need to listen, because the community is definitely being negatively impacted. And I think that that's been, some of the positives that have come out, is that when you keep persistently letting them know that this is the negative impacts that you're having, that you're having these experiences, they cannot continue to ignore you. They have to acknowledge the fact that you're dealing with this. And we've had a chance to use media to write articles, to let them know, to highlight our experiences, to make phone calls, to come to meetings, and just consistently tell them, even at our advisory neighborhood commissioners, is to have these agencies come out, to have us be able to challenge them on the things that the permits and other things are falling short of, and to let them know that there's a community here that you're constructing around, and you need to make sure that you address the concerns. And so I think that's been very helpful.
So what I'm hearing you say, Rhonda, is it's really important to be persistent and to be creative about how you engage and who you engage and what your message is with them. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. Welcome folks again. We have just a few minutes left, but welcome folks again to ask questions. If you want to there's a raise hand in the reactions button, or a thumbs up, I guess. Or put your question to the chat. And I see one that I don't think we've talked too much about yet. The question is, what is being done to educate the community affected by these environmental issues? So maybe Ron and Jennifer, could you talk real quick about how you, and maybe let me phrase it this way, how you take something that is really technical and engage people around connected to the impacts that they're feeling and they're experiencing, and then sort of engage them to get involved in the actions around it. And Rhonda, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think a lot of times these environmental concerns are very difficult, especially when you start talking about the terminologies of air quality, particulate matter, dust. And one of the things that we found has been very helpful is just prior to this, we were doing workshops with community members to talk about environmental concerns, to talk about the different sources of pollution. A lot of times we'll do door-to-door, door knocking, talking to residents, making telephone calls to kind of tell them about the different issues, because a lot of our residents are not on computers, so there's a huge digital divide. So a lot of times the way that we are able to connect with them is through calls and in-person meetings. But they really love doing workshops and talking about the different concerns and just being informed of through flyers, sometimes I printed up flyers to let people know, because oftentimes there's not flyers. So those have been the communication ways we've reached people.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I think that's been a big element of the sewage backups work, because I think people have obviously a very visceral reaction to a sewage backing up into their home, but people don't necessarily know how hazardous it actually is to touch it and clean it up. And because the city doesn't provide direct assistance with cleaning up sewage backups, that's one of the programs, one of the changes they've promised over the summer, but it hasn't yet been implemented. For years, people have been faced with the choice of paying thousands of dollars for someone who's qualified to clean up a hazmat level situation, which it really is in their home like that. And either just losing that money or fronting it and crossing their fingers, the city reimburses them later, maybe, or cleaning it up themselves. A lot of people end up cleaning it up themselves, and it can make people very, very sick. And materials that the city has put out about sewage backups aren't as specific and clear as they could be about that point, about the fact that it is very dangerous, potentially very hazardous to clean it up yourself, and it's best to get someone who's qualified, or at minimum have a lot of protective equipment. And then as this reimbursement program rolled out in spring and summer 2018, one of the things we began hearing from community members and noticing was that it wasn't being promoted very heavily. People were not being informed either proactively or after a sewage backup occurred to them that they had this choice of reimbursement for this through the city. And so we kind of went on a tour. I spoke to about 60 community associations across Baltimore City over the course of that year to educate people about the hazards of cleaning up sewage backups and that it is a big health hazard, and then informing people about the reimbursement program. And in doing that and connecting with more and more people who had had sewer backups and been forced to clean it up themselves, or not been informed about the reimbursement program and had missed their window of opportunity to apply because it is quite narrow. There was actually a 24-hour reporting requirement originally, and that's one of the things that we had changed. Learning about both the health hazards and then the this information from the city that wasn't getting out into communities really motivated a lot of people to pay attention to what was going on in City Hall and in the consent decree process to change it.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in 2 more questions. I see we just have a couple of minutes left.
Jay, I see one question that came in earlier.
Mm-hmm.
How does making the environment better help with health disparities in the community?
Yeah, would you like to ask that one or answer that one?
Sure. I think that being in a healthy environment does help with health disparities, because a lot of times when you're living in a environment with pollutants, it contributes to negative health impacts. So I think for us that breathing in these contaminated air and dealing with all these environmental challenges, it has led to a lot of health disparities. And I think if those things are corrected and we are living in a healthy environment free of those hazards, then we will have less incidents of cancer, heart disease, people having respiratory ailments. So I think that's one good step that the city could take to improve our overall health.
Yeah, I think something may be worth highlighting also, and echoing exactly what you said, Rhonda, is that Jennifer, earlier you said that it's really difficult to tell if there actually is a cancer cluster in Frederick and there's mixed data. Mm-hmm. And from what I understand, when you're talking about that kind of like epidemiological data, like it really does depend on how you slice things. And it's really easy to sort of say, oh, there's no problem in this area. Or you change the way you look at it, the lens you look at it with, and it's like, oh, there's really obviously a problem in this area. And so, yeah, maybe do you have a chance to talk real quick about how you deal with that when you're looking at data and you know from the people on the ground that there is obviously a concentrated problem, but data is not necessarily on your side, or maybe the more official data, the more recognized data is not on your side?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. You really cannot draw a very obvious correlation between like the contaminated groundwater and some of the folks we're working with who have had cancer. Like you cannot possibly say that like our community partners' cases of cancer or the autoimmune diseases in my family or anything else are directly tied to Fort Detrick. There's just no way to say that causality. And so I think a lot of the way that I talk about it is using the precautionary principle, where instead of saying like, I know for a fact that this particular incident was caused by this contamination, we can't, which you can never do about any particular instance, you can say that we know that there are these contaminants in the groundwater. We know for a fact that it can cause these type of things. So looking into the future, what are the steps we can take to minimize that risk and minimize that exposure to people? And I think that both is sort of forward thinking, looking at reducing people's risk is very important and is a more sort of direct scientific argument to be able to make.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe just one more question. I'd like to ask Rhonda this. There's a question, what is the best way for overburdened communities to access, and I want to specifically sort of focus on the legal empowerment strategies, and thinking about it in terms of when you started looking at the permitting, the regulatory, and started doing FOIA requests, like how was that? Like, did it feel pretty intimidating at first, or how did you get into that? And how did you educate yourself about those processes and regulations?
In time, because before the soccer stadium was constructed, there was a comment period that opened. The documents of assessments for those were like thousands of pages, and we had 30 days to review those. It was overwhelming. And so what I learned is that a lot of times through our community partners, because I do not have an environmental background. And so a lot of the knowledge that I've been able to gain has been working with other environmental experts and looking at and understanding what the challenges are. And then partnering with Namati and looking at the permits, you learn how to look as sort of like the important parts of the permit, the highlights. A lot of times the permits could be intimidating, but working together as a group to kind of go through those, take our time to go through those, highlighting what are some of the challenges. It has been helpful in teaching us as community members who do not have this background that you can look through the permits, but you can also work with other people who do have environmental knowledge and who can assist those with through the legal empowerment process. So don't feel that the community shouldn't have to feel that you have to do it on your own. Reach out to your local universities, reach out to your local groups within the organizations, and residents a lot of times have background. They may have lawyers who can look through legal documents. They may have people who are able to just, who know other community members and can speak to them. So I think that just approaching it, learning to approach it as a team and a group effort is the best approach to go, because a lot of times we can rely on each other to help us look at those documents and permits.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, and thank you, Jennifer. Ron, I think we'll close with that comment, and I just wanted to share our contact information if anyone has additional questions. Thank you all for attending. It's been great talking with you. Hope you enjoyed this panel. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.